So yes, as I was just telling people, this sounds very broad because I'm covering World Wars I and II. However, I'm just looking at two particular a source and an adaptation. So to just kind of start off with, Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes stories are representative of the classic detective genre, and they're often considered essential reading for mystery lovers throughout the world. The works are often holistically classified as characteristic Edwardian pieces through the setting of Victorian London, kind of the fog and gas lamp setting. But they also reflect the political anxieties and hopes of imperialist and pre-war Britain. So in this presentation, I'm going to look at Conan Doyle's last Holmes story. It's called His Last Bow, in light of World War II era Holmesian propaganda. I'll compare the representation of Holmes in Conan Doyle's story with the detective portrayed later in the 1943 Rathbone film, Sherlock Holmes in Washington. So Sherlock Holmes is most often considered in light of his Conan Doyle's treatment of the colonial other. So that era where Britain is going around and colonizing all these countries, Conan Doyle brings a lot of that into his stories. So post-colonial scholar Yumna Sidikwa writes that Doyle's unusually consistent pattern of representation of the returned colonial reveals certain recurrent anxieties about imperialism. Many characters who, quote, return to England after a sojourn in the colonies have an outlandish aspect. One owns a pet Indian mongoose, another has lost his leg to a crocodile, and the third keeps a fiendish hound. Doyle himself was an enormous advocate of the Second Boer War, writing a pamphlet in support of the British cause, using the empiricism that Sherlock Holmes was so famous for. So many scholars argue that this patriotism that Doyle writes about is in support of that colonialism present in the time period. And he's trying to increase pro-empire support among middle-brow consumers of magazines that his work was most often published in, like The Strand. However, in the final collection of Holmes stories, we see Conan Doyle beginning to create villains from German spies instead of from colonial threats. These European others are indirectly present in stories like The Adventure of the Bruce Partington Plans. However, in Doyle's 1917 short story, His Last Bow, the German is no longer an ambiguous third party, but an arch-villain that Sherlock Holmes must defeat. It's very dramatic. So as kind of a summary of that story, Holmes comes out of retirement in order to apprehend von Bork, a notorious German spy who's been posing as an English country gentleman. In order to capture him, Holmes fakes his role as an informant in order to gain von Bork's trust. To do so, Holmes spends 2 years in America constructing a false identity and becoming von Bork's supposed henchman. When Holmes brings the fake naval papers to von Bork, he uses this moment to accuse him of silencing previous informants and then later arrests him and has a party. Anyways, very, very typical of Doyle. So this moment where Holmes accuses von Bork of silencing previous informants is actually really important in my discussion of patriotism and Englishness. So through this accusation, Holmes is actually trying to strip von Bork of any characteristics of honor, even among thieves. So the idea of honor and honor among thieves, this kind of falls under this idea of sportsmanship, a tradition that I think best represents the sense of Englishness promoted in His Last Bow. I use the term Englishness to describe personal qualities praised in these Holmesian propaganda pieces. Thomas Hitchner writes that spy literature at the beginning of the 20th century advocated meeting international threats with the English virtues of cleverness, courage, and honorable competition, so best represented by the tradition of sportsmanship. So the Holmes story uses these characteristics in order to kind of silence von Bork and make him a non-citizen, because he's been using disguise and he's been kind of faking his role as an English citizen. So he has to actually kind of take that identity away from him. And by winning the competition, Holmes proves himself as the more clever one, and he strips von Bork of yet another virtue tied to sportsmanship. And so, thus, von Bork is alienated from English virtues and results in his othering. So, moving on to the film. So Conan Doyle's use of sportsmanship as Englishness to alienate Germans in a wartime context is used similarly in a World War II era film adaptation, Sherlock Holmes in Washington, made in 1943. It's part of a 12-part film series from Universal Pictures starring Basil Rathbone as Holmes. So this is the first film in the picture series not based on a Conan Doyle source text. There's actually another adaptation that's attributed to His Last Vow. So this isn't actually acknowledged as an adaptation of this particular text. However, it uses the same formula. Rathbone actually wrote in his autobiography that the films are endless positives of the same photograph, a photograph of propaganda. So I'm actually going to show you a little bit of this film just so you can get a sense of kind of what kind of overt propaganda that they're using. Let's start there.
Say, you're a smart fellow, Holmes. Here's the microfilm, Holmes.
Thank you, Senator.
I say, Holmes.
This is the microfilm, the document on it. It will be in the proper hands within the hour. As I told you, Mr. Stanley, the man who had it didn't know he had it. Come on, let's go.
Well, it'll be nice to get home to Baker Street, eh, Holmes?
Yes. But this is a great country, Watson.
It certainly is, my dear fellow.
Look, up there ahead. The Capitol. The very heart of this democracy.
Democracy. The only hope for the future, eh, Holmes?
It's not given to us to peer into the mysteries of the future. But in the days to come, the British and American people will, for their own safety and for the good of all, walk together in majesty, in justice, and in peace.
That's magnificent. I quite agree with you.
Not with me, with Mr. Winston Churchill. I was quoting from the speech he made not so long ago, in that very building.
So that's the end of the film. It's not very subtle, is it? So although they kind of the source text and the film preface two different world wars, they both use Holmes's status as a cultural icon to promote the Allied cause. Scholar Amanda Field notes that in character adaptation, Holmes is constantly updated to fit the cultural context of the time. She argues that each new interpretation of Holmes was therefore both the Victorian creation of Doyle and the man of the moment. So, as the Victorian creation of Doyle, he represents that English idea of sportsmanship. However, regardless of the reinterpretations, whatever they may be, they rely on his symbolic embodiment of this sportsmanship as a recognizable quality. And so his sportsmanship is a part of his British cultural identity and is intrinsically tied to this idea of nationalism. So Holmes is brilliant And his brilliance and his success as a detective is tied to his cultural identity, which in propaganda pieces is used to promote the cause. So similar to His Last Bow, this is kind of a summary of the film, because you got to see the end of it, but it's actually set up very similarly to the source text. So the film Sherlock Holmes in Washington uses elements of sportsmanship to unmask and other a German spy, but it does so in an American setting that emphasizes the difference between British and American cultures. In Sherlock Holmes in Washington, Rathbone stars as the typical British detective, and much like in His Last Bow, Holmes is summoned by patriotic duty to investigate the disappearance of important documents. Holmes rushes to Washington, D.C., where he discovers that the Secret Service agent entrusted with the documents has been murdered. The film climax reveals that the arch-villain is actually Herr Heinrich Hinkel, a notorious German spy. So both His Last Bow and Sherlock Holmes in Washington use disguise to conceal the identities of the detective and arch-villain until the climax, where the crime is reconstructed and the villain is unmasked. Sherlock Holmes in Washington, the climax occurs when Holmes confronts Hinkel, and they're both disguised in this context of antiques. So Holmes is a doddering antiques collector, and Hinkel has owned this antique shop that is also, the basement is his headquarters for his spy operation. And so they actually use artifacts to debate the validity of their disguises. Really interesting scene. So in the end, Holmes, of course, outmatches Hinkel, and the cultural identity of cleverness and honorable competition, they're both used in this sense. So both parties use disguise to accomplish their goals. One of the major differences between His Last Bow and Sherlock Holmes in Washington is that the film is set in America and not Britain for the majority of the plot. Universal, as an American film company, takes Sherlock Holmes out of his traditional frame of reference, Victorian London, gas street lamps, and borrows his status as a cultural icon to lend credibility to the Allied cause. However, in borrowing Holmes as a cultural icon, the film also appropriates his Englishness as a tool for pro-Allied propaganda. Amanda Field points out that because Holmes has been customarily perceived as Victorian, it was difficult for the studio to move him entirely into the contemporary without audiences feeling like they'd lost the real Holmes. So in appropriating this idea of Englishness, the American-made Sherlock Holmes in Washington uses the real Holmes to support democracy as the only hope for the future, as you saw in that clip. So in conclusion, even if it's not directly acknowledged as an adaptation of His Last Bow, Sherlock Holmes in Washington is an extension of the political goals and propaganda techniques used in Conan Doyle's story. Both mediums create others out of a German spy using English sportsmanship as the cultural standard for this alienation. As an adaptation, Sherlock Holmes in Washington extends the political legacy of Arthur Conan Doyle's last chronological Holmes story. The ease with which Conan Doyle's written work could be adapted to this purpose not only indicates Holmes' status as a British literary icon, but also his relevancy as a cultural embodiment of English sportsmanship in the face of international threats. Thank you.